Charlas de la Noche, Palabras con Imagen, con Alfredo Penilla y Francisco Durán Rosillo.
Bienvenidos a Charlas de la Noche, Palabras con Imagen. Hoy tenemos a alguien que no es ajeno a este programa. A diario ustedes lo escuchan, su voz presentando la entrada y la salida del programa. Adrián Bernal, graduado de la Universidad de Texas, con mucha experiencia en CNN, tiene su programa en 89.3 FM y varios programas más en inglés. Y hoy se tomó el tiempo de dedicarle un programa al activista John Lewis, que hoy empiezan una serie de homenajes, el senador por los Estados Unidos, que fue herido en Selma, Alabama, y es justamente hoy allí donde se le está haciendo un homenaje. Buenas noches, Adrián.
Buenas noches, Francisco, qué gusto estar con ustedes hoy.
Adrián, ¿qué te motivó a hacer ese programa especial que quedó tan bonito y que a continuación lo vamos a reproducir y a traducir?
Muy bien. Francisco, pues, claro, el congresista Lewis ha afectado y tocado a mucha gente en todas partes, pero lo que me hizo hacer eso es porque había tantos homenajes a él, pero yo conozco a Teresa Elamin, que como van a escuchar fue alguien que lo conoció cuando ella tenía 17 años y John Lewis tenía 24 y estaban en Alabama en el SNCC, que se llama SNCC, NSC, el Comité Estudiantil Antiviolencia. Entonces pues pensé preguntarle a ella y nos da un relato de cómo lo conocía y además nos dice otras cosas que estaban sucediendo cuando ella era muy joven y todo alrededor de esa era de la gente peleando por los derechos civiles.
Wow, pues es algo interesantísimo. Te agradecemos, Adrián, tu tiempo porque sabemos que tienes una entrevista adelante, entonces no te queremos entretener, pero muchas gracias y te voy a pasar el link para que la escuches y la pases también a tu audiencia. Buenas noches, Adrián.
Muy amable, gracias. Gracias.
Pues como ya lo escucharon de viva voz de Adrián Bernal, él entrevistó a la gente que fue motivada por el senador John Lewis, en aquel entonces activista de los derechos civiles, y lo más interesante es que John Lewis empezó su carrera de activista en Illinois, en un pueblo donde la población afroamericana era sumamente azotada. Entonces, el hecho de haber logrado contacto con el doctor Martin Luther King se da en una situación, pues realmente como son esas situaciones de la vida que el destino los junta, y el doctor Martin Luther King invita a Lewis a participar de sus actividades, y es ahí donde van a Selma, Alabama, hace más de 50 años, y después el doctor King lo invita a la Plaza de Nueva York, a aquel gran discurso donde el doctor King dijo que él tenía un sueño, el sueño de ver juntos a afroamericanos y blancos conviviendo como una familia, comiendo en una misma mesa. De hecho, en televisión, una ocasión quisimos utilizar para un documental en Turner Network Television ese fragmento del Dr. King. Y el King Center de Estudios en Atlanta nos dijo que ellos son los dueños de ese fragmento de video y que nos cobrarían $100,000 por cada minuto de video que utilizáramos al aire. Ahora, si lo queríamos con derechos de exclusividad, iba a ser un poco más caro. En aquella ocasión yo era coordinador de investigaciones de Turner Network Televisión para los asuntos latinos hispanohablantes y me di a la tarea de hablarle a la secretaria del hijo del Dr. King y le dije que ese fragmento no se iba a comercializar, sino que teníamos un bloque de películas como en Al calor de la noche, In the Heat of the Night, con aquel famoso artista francés, y varias gentes afroamericanas, varias películas, Fried Green Tomatoes, varias. Y queríamos hacer un homenaje, un tributo a la población afroamericana de los Estados Unidos en aquellos tiempos. Entonces, el hijo del doctor King se portó muy amable conmigo, pese a mi inglés muy marcado, con mucho acento, me dio la oportunidad de usar el fragmento y realmente fue algo pues que nos motivó, porque la franquicia, si no hubiera tenido esa parte de video, no hubiese funcionado, no hubiese tenido el peso que merecería. Entonces, realmente fue algo maravilloso. Después hasta recibimos algunos comentarios, nuestra vicepresidente Charlotte Leonard Engel, de parte de Ted Turner, que estaba muy contento, pues él acababa de comprar la librería de Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer con 600 películas para enriquecer los canales. Entonces fue aquello una idea sumamente original y pues recordamos que varias de las participaciones de los artistas fueron premiadas. Sidney Poitier, el actor afroamericano de nacionalidad francesa, lo aclaro, que participó en The Heat of the Night, pues hizo un papel estelar. Varias de las películas llegaron con premios de la Academia y nosotros teníamos 10 de ellas en la librería de Turner Broadcasting System. Entonces vamos a dar a conocer en fragmentos para darles una pequeña traducción al final de lo que trata cada parte que hizo Adrián Bernal. Advierto, este programa fue dado a conocer en todos los Estados Unidos. Adrián es una voz y un presentador de mucha fama a nivel nacional en todo Estados Unidos, y esta noche está también en la estación de FM 89.3 FM, va a estar en La Voz de América y va a estar en varias estaciones más. Entonces yo le pedí permiso a Adrián y su producción. De hecho, él es su propio productor de su programa y nos autorizó llevar estas 3 partes, estos 3 tributos en Charlas de la Noche, Palabras con Imagen. Vamos a escuchar el primero, en el que se entremezclan las actividades del senador John Lewis y cómo motivaron a Milt Tambor y a Bob Wofter a ser parte de esa lucha social en la que los Estados Unidos logró darles el derecho a votar a los afroamericanos y se acabó con la esclavitud. Vamos a escucharlo y regresamos en unos segundos. Gracias.
There was a number of famous civil rights leaders who passed away the other week. Of course, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, but there were other folks that passed on. This one was a person that I had a chance to meet. His name was Robert Woolholter, and he was an activist, somebody who was in the streets and was always ready to help out any of the movements, any of the groups that needed help. Bob Woolholter moved to Minneapolis with his wife a year ago where he wanted to be closer to his grandchildren. And news came last week that he had also passed away the same time that C.T. Vivian and John Lewis did. Robert Wohlholter had been connected with Dougie the Abolitionist when Dougie started a program on WIGO AM 1570, and Bob helped Dougie post the show on the website that he helped him start. So we reached out to Milt Tambor, who together with Bob founded the MADSA back in 2006, and this is what he had to say.
Yeah, he was one of the first of founding members. Let's go back to 2006. But what was very special about him was that he was our webmaster. We were trying to get a website going, and I don't know how he developed that kind of skill, but he put together a website for us, and that put us on the board. That gave us some credibility and presence. So that was very special. He was also,
right,
I would call him somewhat of a Renaissance man, because he was a scientist. He retired from CDC, and he actually went to China a number of times to do some teaching, and he knew about literature. And in fact, Bertolt Brecht, he was real knowledgeable about his work. The Workers' Progress, WPA, and the history of a lot of the literature that came from the WPA. So he was really had a good sense of history and a good connection to literature. So that was very special. And then, as you probably heard at some of our Douglas Debs dinner, he would play a role. He had a little dramatic flair to him, and he played Bill Hayward, acted as Robin Hood in one of our skits that we did at the Douglas Debs dinner. He had a great sense of humor, and he had this booming voice that really would get your attention. But the thing that I found was that people remembered him because he was the man with the power. So he was the sound man for a number of different organizations, and he was always there ready to help out. There's something I would like to share. I gave him my memoir to read. He read it all, and he shared something which I think will tell you a lot about him. Here's what he wrote. The forces of evolution over 100 millennia or so molded the human brain in such a way that our sense of social consciousness, altruism, fairness, and human dignity are the prime elements of our fitness as a species. Ignoring these instincts in favor of self-aggrandizement will surely lead to our extinction. So you can get a picture of how he thought and how he wrote and what an intellectual approach he had to that. He shared also something very special, too, with me. He said, I had a very different path than you in terms of what my career was and how I got involved as an activist. And he said, but somehow we both met at the same place, and that's the building of the Democratic Socialists of America in Atlanta. So there was something nice about that. He understood that different paths you take, if you land in the right place, or the left place, I should say, that's really good. And I really will miss him. He was somebody like you would describe unheralded, but he was there for people. He was there to help out other activists. And when we had demonstrations, he would be there. He was involved in our education programs and helped shape that as well. So I will miss him.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plow the prairies.
All right, we're back. And there was a number of deaths that happened last week. The death of prominent civil rights leaders and a number of people who were just involved in the movement. Of course, one of the people who you certainly have heard a lot about was Reverend C.T. Vivian. He made his mark in the civil rights movement. He started quite early, but in 1965, he and other activists were at the Dallas County Courthouse in Selma, Alabama, trying to register black voters. And while he was talking, the Sheriff Jim Clark, a noted segregationist, punched Vivian in the mouth, knocking him to the ground. And, of course, the media was there, and they took photographs of this. Vivian did not retaliate. He got himself up, and he continued arguing for the people's right to vote. Of course, they took him off to jail, but before that, he had to have 11 stitches in his mouth where the sheriff hit him. In fact, he hit him so hard that the sheriff had a fracture in his hand. So that symbol of nonviolence, the nonviolence that C.T. Vivian showed that day, of course, made him known throughout the world for doing that. And it made Clark an ugly symbol of violence and segregation and racial hatred. So C.T. Vivian died on July 17th at 3 a.m. His daughter confirmed that. He was 95 years old. Martin Luther King used to talk about him for his wit and his humor. So I had the pleasure of meeting Reverend Vivian several times here in the last a few years. So very glad that I was able to meet him. Also, of course, a person who died was John Lewis. And John Lewis, of course, I'm sure you've seen his information everywhere. He started off as the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then he went on after that to run for office, and he was the only person who spoke from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in the summer of 1963, and when he addressed the African American people and the world from those steps just before Martin Luther King took to the stage. He was the only person that had been on that stage in 1963 who witnessed the election of the nation's first African-American president. Throughout his career, he was arrested for civil rights protests more than 40 times. So I know that you've been hearing a number of stories about John Lewis, and I thought it would be nice to check in with Teresa Elamine, who is an activist. She is a former organizer for the unions and has worked for a number of unions, but she did start when she was quite young, working with SNCC. She was 17 years old when she joined SNCC when she was going to college. And then, so she had a number of connections with Representative John Lewis. So let's see what she had to say about him.
You know, all of us knew each other back then. When I joined SNCC, I was 17. And when we came back to Atlanta that summer of 1966, and John Lewis was the chair of SNCC, and he took me to the Atlanta office where I wanted to volunteer and help with the office work. Yeah, but that year, 1966, John Lewis set me up at the office to help with the filing. And so I would get to be in the office late at night sometimes when they were having all kinds of meetings. And I'll never forget a meeting where then Stokely Carmichael, Julian Bond, and John Lewis were talking about the fact that John was on the board of SCLC when he was the chair of SNCC. And for some reason, that seemed to be a problem in Stokely Carmichael's mind. And I sat there listening to the conversation. And John was just so quiet. And Stokely was just fussing at him and talking so mean to John. And John just left the office, hardly without a word. And then Stokely was elected chair of SNCC that summer. And so it was quite interesting, the dynamics in the movement during that Black Power summer, when lots of bad things were happening in terms of the FBI infiltrating SNCC, and with COINTELPRO. It was terrible what was going on, and there were so many agents around, and I would go to the door sometimes and I'd shout upstairs and say, "It's Jimmy." And then somebody said, "Don't open that door, he's an agent." My mother, Dorothy Shaw, was president of the Wheat Street Towers Tenants Association there on Auburn Avenue, right near the King Center. And my mother was very active in politics. And so everybody running for office came to my mother to ask for the vote, because my mother set up a polling place. And so some of us are friends to this day, and we look forward to seeing each other, like Bob Moore, who was part of the Atlanta project of SNCC, with Julian Bond and others who were really challenging the Vietnam War. And so that was a big deal back then. So lots of the folks who were involved with SNCC who challenged the Vietnam War under the leadership of Julian Bond and others who were speaking out. And of course, Martin Luther King began to speak out against the war too. And so that was the time it was for me back then, and getting involved with the labor movement and getting to work with folks who were involved with SNCC through the labor movement. And so, there's a paper that's written about civil rights movement folks turning to labor, because he started way before many of us were born. He was already doing the sit-ins and everything. And so I know a lot of his leadership and his influence was there for us students, since he was like the real father of it all. I was really a very young person at the age of 17 when I was introduced to SNCC in 1965. And so I was just, my affiliation with the folks in that section of the movement was really with SNCC folks. So I knew the SNCC folks, the younger folks who were in their teens and their 20s at the time I was involved, because the average involvement for most SNCC people was a few months or a year or so, unless you were one of the field reps who received what I heard was $10 a week to work for the organization. Well, I took a job at the phone company in 1966 after I came back from Tuskegee, and my mother was like, "You blown your scholarship to Tuskegee, running around talking about Black power. You get a job." And so I went and got a union job at the phone company, joined the union. And so I became a union activist. And that's how I began to meet quite a few of the SNCC folks who also had become involved with labor unions, because there's a significant number of us who ended up being union organizers. And that's what happened to me after years at the phone company. I got recruited to be a union organizer and was moved to Cleveland. And so that's kind of my history. And as you know, Adrian, I'm going to be writing a book about it. Wow. And so I'm going to take a sabbatical next year and write a book about it. And I have lots of photos, and the photo of me with John, I want to make sure that it gets in the book, because he was such an important influence on my mother, and of course on me. Just seeing him as a young student, and he was like 25 years old, and I was 17. And so just to see all of us young people there together, working together to change the world, and how he never stopped. He just kept doing it. And when we got the Voting Rights Act passed, then everybody started looking towards getting elected and moving in that direction. And of course, John Lewis and Andrew Young and others who got elected to office. Julian Bond, I worked on his special election campaign that year in 1966, where he had been denied his seat in the state legislature, and then won it. And then in 1968, at the Democratic Party convention, Fannie Lou Hamer, who had been fighting for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, she was speaking at that convention, and all of the states around the South. She didn't just bring along Mississippi, she brought Georgia and all of the other states. So Julian Bond headed up the Georgia delegation that year. It was a powerful year to push the Dixiecrats out of the Democratic Party with their all-white primaries and pushed them all into the Republican Party, which is why the Republican Party is what it is today. And that all the black folks who used to be in the party of Lincoln as Republican now put all their eggs in the Democratic Party basket. And it's been somewhat of a disappointment, I must say, that we have just kind of opted for the lesser evil politics. But it was John's party, and he was loyal to it, as so many other black Democrats have been loyal to the party. But now the party has to do something for black people in the United States. And that will be the big determination as we go forward, now that we all agree Black Lives Matter.
All right. Thank you to Teresa El Amin for that information on the Representative John Lewis. May he rest in power. And before we finish this section, we want to turn to Mumia Abu Jamal, who does a project called Prison Radio. This is what he had to say about John Lewis.
John Lewis, no longer in the house. John Lewis, famed for his ungodly beating by state troopers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge during civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s, has moved on after his recent passing at 80 years old. Lewis was a youth when he joined the movement and went on to spend over 30 years as a U.S. representative from Georgia. His life lent luster to a group of politicians who usually garner low marks on public opinion polls. Before this electoral period, as a young man, he led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC by movement people, before Stokely Carmichael replaced him as chair of the group. Carmichael, who later took the names Kwame Ture to honor African leaders, represented the growing militancy of the Black freedom movement. Lewis became the archetype of activist turned politician and also exemplar of the civil rights movement itself. In many ways, he, the son of sharecroppers, exemplified the classic American story of a spectacular rise from modest beginnings. He held fast to the teachings of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the rest of his life. John Lewis, 1940-2020. March to his ancestors after 80 summers of life. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
We'll be right back.
Vinieron en tardes serenas de estío, cruzando los aires en vuelo veloz, y en tibios aleros formaron sus nidos formaron pillando de amor. Qué blancos sus pechos, sus alas, qué bellas sus alas formadas en cruz. Y cómo alegraban las tardes aquellas bañadas de luz.
Y como varios de ustedes acaban de escuchar, a través de los tributos que se le han rendido merecidamente a John Robert Lewis, el congresista que nació el 21 de febrero de 1940, lamentablemente un cáncer pancreático, pues le hizo perder la vida el 17 de julio de este 2020. Ahora, pues este político americano no era un político, es un líder que ha dejado un legado para todos. Y algo que a mí me llama mucho la atención, es que en los Estados Unidos los líderes sí son tal. Con todo respeto, en México no se ve liderazgo puro. Quienes hacen un aparente liderazgo es porque buscan una posición política. Ya cuando les dan su curul, les dan su puesto en el Senado, les dan un hueso, como se dice popularmente, ya hasta se olvidan de la causa que en algún momento abanderaron. Y ojalá que el doctor Luis nos sirva de ejemplo a muchos, porque él tuvo muchísimas anécdotas. En una universidad fue rechazado, pese a que pasó todos los exámenes de admisión. Y fue rechazado por el hecho de su color de piel. Y eso, pues, también le hace merecedor de un tributo. Su féretro, con su cuerpo en el interior, pasará unas horas en esa universidad para que precisamente la gente se percate de que no solamente se hizo famoso y héroe de los derechos civiles por haber recibido un golpe con un ladrillo en la cabeza. No. John Lewis, aparte de todo, hizo discursos memorables que marcaron la vida de los Estados Unidos, de los derechos civiles, y cuyo legado ha servido para mantener la figura del doctor Martin Luther King, quien lo invitó precisamente a seguir con él en todo momento. Entonces, tenemos que pensar y no dejar pasar por alto que este homenaje, que estos tributos se queden para siempre en la memoria de las nuevas generaciones. Y también ha habido algunos hispanos, porque acudí al mural que hay en su nombre en el centro de Atlanta, donde mucha gente está poniendo flores, estampas, veladoras, mensajes. También me encontré latinos, una madre latina con su hijo, y se me hizo un detalle muy bonito, porque los latinos en general, también hindúes, judíos, asiáticos, tenemos que reconocer que fue gracias a la lucha de estos héroes civiles por quienes ellos nos supieron dar un lugar en esta sociedad sureña, donde el inmigrante, donde la gente de color era tan rechazada, tan mal vista. Yo todavía, cuando llegué a finales de los 80s a Atlanta, todavía me tocó ver vestigios, baños donde los lavabos no los podían usar la gente de color. Todavía estaba ahí el letrero, solo para gente blanca, y el de la gente de color estaba afuera, en una condición más paupérrima. Entonces, han sido muchas cosas por las cuales han pasado. Sin embargo, el hecho de que hayan luchado, y yo se los digo honestamente, hay gente de color muy buena, hay gente de color muy estudiada, y me frustra mucho que algunos ignorantes sean utilizadas y utilizados por vendedrogas, por pandilleros, para cometer actos vandálicos, como sucedió ante la muerte de esos 2 afroamericanos, y que fueron saqueando negocio por negocio, incendiándolo, destrozándolo. Eso no afectó a nadie más que a la gente de raza negra. Ellos mismos se sepultaron en su propia violencia. Y qué lástima, porque están sepultando con esos actos vandálicos el legado del doctor Martin Luther King, ganador del Premio Nobel de la Paz. El legado de todos estos líderes que le ayudaron a integrar una sociedad de respeto hacia los afroamericanos. El legado de los derechos civiles. No los sepulten, no sean parte de las pandillas, no sean parte de los actos violentos, porque todo eso afecta en demasía a todos, no nada más a unos cuantos. Me despido y nos escuchamos mañana.
Escuchaste el análisis de la noticia transparente como el agua, con Alfredo Penilla y Francisco Durán Rosillo.